The order was signed in a locked room, one sentence and a pen. That sentence: effective immediately, Canada authorizes retaliatory tariffs on $22 billion worth of U.S. imports at a 50% rate. Within 6 hours, Ford halted cross-border chassis transfers. Budweiser called a crisis board meeting. Aluminum smelters in Saguenay went into overtime. Donald Trump had aimed to strike Canada's steel nerve. Carney had just hit back at the entire American Midwest. The legal foundation for Carney's move was built on the very clause Trump used. Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Expansion Act, national security. But Ottawa's twist was clinical. If you claim your national interest, Carney's trade memo read, we'll respond by defending ours, supply integrity, energy flow, and environmental parity. His language mirrored the U.S. line word for word, then turned it inside out. And yet, both governments now claim to be protecting their citizens from the same threat: each other. The U.S. tariffs began in March: 25% on Canadian steel, 10% on aluminum. Trump's administration cited transshipped Chinese metal, though Customs and Border Protection had found no documented violation through Canada. Leaked memos from the USTR to the National Economic Council show that the goal was not enforcement, but leverage. Trump's team wanted Canada out of low-emission subsidies talks at the OECD Metals Forum. That document, published by Bloomberg on May 14, confirms one thing: this was never just about steel. In contrast, Carney's retaliation was deliberately surgical. The target list, vetted by the Canadian Border Services Agency and modeled with data from Statistics Canada, included U.S.-made rolled steel, aluminum ingots, food-grade cans, agricultural tools, and pressure valves, each used in bilateral production loops. The result? Ottawa wasn't just taxing imports. It was taxing the fragility of a shared economic system. Trump, who had branded himself as a dealmaker, had just watched a decade-long supply chain alliance turned into a customs war zone. The first casualty? Windsor. As of July 1st, 3 out of 5 auto parts warehouses on the Ontario-Michigan border stopped receiving bulk shipments. A supplier for General Motors, Gordian Metalworks, filed for emergency bridge credit with the Bank of Montreal after aluminum costs jumped 27% in just 2 weeks. We're being priced out of our own market, said CEO Dana Liu. The irony? Gordian's facility uses U.S. bauxite, processed in Canada, shipped back to Detroit. Carney's tariffs hit both ends of the loop, on purpose. While the White House stayed mostly silent, back-channel panic set in. According to a Reuters dispatch from Capitol Hill, 7 Republican senators, including John Thune and Bill Cassidy, circulated a letter warning that ongoing tariffs may compromise supply assurance for U.S. defense contractors. 2 of the alloys now hit by Canada's list, 7075T6 and 5083H131, are used in both Tesla's Gigafactory presses and Lockheed Martin's naval armor kits. In private, even Pentagon officials reportedly raised concerns. Carney hadn't targeted U.S. jobs. He targeted U.S. readiness. Meanwhile, Carney unveiled a counterweight, the Green Steel Conversion Fund. 4.8 billion Canadian dollars in low-interest loans and tax incentives aim to pivot Canadian steel from blast furnaces to electric arc production by 2027. The Financial Times noted this strategy, saying it turns a retaliatory tariff into an industrial policy wedge. Trump tried to isolate Canada's metals. Carney used the attack to accelerate its transformation. The contradiction deepened. One economy protecting the past, the other investing in its exit. Data confirms the shift. According to RBC Economics, 61% of aluminum capacity in Canada now qualifies as low carbon under OECD guidelines. In contrast, U.S. mills in Alabama and Indiana exceed the emissions threshold by 38%. If Ottawa pushes carbon scoring as a trade norm, as it now signals, the U.S. may find its own production disqualified from future European contracts under the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What began as a tariff could become a global certification war. And now, the real twist. U.S. trade lawyers may have undermined their own case. Under the USMCA Clause 10.8.2, signatories must consult before invoking trade action on grounds of national security. Trump's March tariffs skip this step. Canada's legal team, briefed by the WTO's former deputy counsel Paul Lamy, is preparing a Geneva case to allege bad faith. If successful, the US may lose credibility not just with Canada, but with Japan, South Korea, and the EU, where it's pursued similar 232 actions. Within 72 hours of Ottawa's tariff activation, Bloomberg recorded a 14% decline in US scrap steel exports to Canada. Normally irrelevant, but this time it choked off feedstock for Canada's secondary production chain, companies like Iveco Rolling Mills and Gerdau Long Steel. Rather than retreat, Carney escalated. He opened consultations to fast-track subsidies for Canadian ferrous recycling plants. His stated logic: if the US won't export scrap, Canada will outbuild them. By week's end, Rio Tinto applied for a $60 million arc furnace conversion credit. Meanwhile, Washington's rhetoric fractured. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a statement warning that Carney's move risked, quote, destroying $8.7 billion worth of annual bilateral industrial exports. But honestly, that number didn't even include the spillover costs. Like the 22-day delay for Class 7 rail shipments now crossing into Canada under these new reinspection orders. The tariff didn't just tax material, it introduced friction. And in modern manufacturing, friction equals cost. In Chicago, Whirlpool sent a memo to distributors warning of, quote, a Tier 2 component shortage expected by late August. Ottawa, for its part, didn't flinch. The CBSA quietly added 33 new compliance auditors to its import verification staff, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency began reviewing dairy, peanut butter, and processed meat shipments from Wisconsin and Iowa. Products that just happened to sit atop Canada's secondary tariff list, scheduled to activate July 21st. No one officially called it pressure, but in diplomatic circles, the message was clear. Steel wasn't the end of the list. It was the beginning. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai requested a private bilateral with Canadian Minister Mary Ng in Brussels. The meeting, described as cordial but unmoving, included a presentation from Ng showing that 74% of U.S. steel products now targeted by Canada originated from non-union shops in right-to-work states, precisely the regions Trump campaigned to protect. It was a trap. Any deal that carved out relief would anger the exact workers Trump needed in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. On the ground, that contradiction exploded. Cleveland-Cliffs, one of the largest integrated steel producers in the United States, warned in its second quarter investor call that Canadian retaliation would force a renegotiation of 2025 supply contracts. Meanwhile, Esser Steel Algoma, just across the border in Sault Ste. Marie, announced it would expand production by 18% to fill short-term U.S. demand at higher prices. In effect, American firms would be paying more to avoid their own country's policy. And voters were about to notice. Carney's tariff list, effective July 21st, includes U.S. citrus concentrates, peanut butter, bourbon, yogurt, frozen beef, and a range of corn derivatives. Why these? Not to punish farmers. Canada doesn't import those products in volume, but to target rural Trump-leaning districts already strained by drought and falling commodity prices. According to USDA data, Florida orange output is down 21% this year. If Canadian buyers vanish, storage costs spike. In other words, Ottawa aimed at shelf space, not GDP. The effect started small. On July 4th, Nova Scotia's largest grocery chain, Sobeys, began replacing Tropicana with French-sourced juice. Then, LCBO announced it would suspend new bourbon orders pending price volatility reviews, and Walmart Canada initiated category risk evaluations on 37 US-made food items. All of this occurred before the tariff technically hit. The message to American exporters: prepare for loss of shelf space, regardless of your politics. The irony is that none of these moves technically violate the USMCA. Section 32.4 of the agreement allows tariff retaliation if the initiating party, here the United States, fails to consult its partners under a dispute. But there's no clause requiring a symmetrical response. That legal gray zone is precisely where Carney is operating. He isn't matching Trump. He's boxing him in, clause by clause, district by district. Canada isn't just retaliating. It's reshaping its entire trade structure. On July 2nd, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland met with representatives from the EU Carbon Adjustment Authority. The goal? align Canada's border carbon tariffs with European standards, effectively allowing dual tariff recovery on emissions-heavy United States imports. According to Reuters, this double-counting approach could add 11 to 18% cost premiums on United States aluminum by year-end, before accounting for existing retaliation. In short, it's a system upgrade, not a tit-for-tat, Trump's counter-move. At a July 6th rally in Scranton, he pledged no surrender to globalists in Ottawa or Brussels. But the business sector interpreted that a bit differently. On July 7th, the National Association of Manufacturers urged a rollback of the Section 232 tariffs. Their statement warned, "We cannot insulate our workers while isolating our markets." At the same time, Tesla began seeking alternate aluminum suppliers in Indonesia, a country with higher emissions. But, lower tariffs. The contradiction reappears. Protect your border and lose your credit. Meanwhile, Canada's internal coalition held firm. Quebec's aluminum bloc, Ontario's auto lobby, and even British Columbia's Microbrewery Association publicly endorsed the tariffs, with caveats. Small producers, like Sawdust City Brewery, warned that a 5-cent can increase could decimate margins. Carney's office responded within 48 hours. Volume-based exemptions for beverage aluminum under a quota system. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was management. And honestly, it outpaced Washington's fragmented election-bound messaging. And what is China doing while all this is going down? Nothing. It's not intervening. It's observing. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce sees the Western tariff spiral as a self-inflicted fracture. According to an internal trade memo obtained by Bloomberg Asia, China has rerouted 27% of its low-cost steel exports via Kazakhstan through the Eurasian Economic Union in the second quarter alone. That's not speculation. It's diversion. While the United States and Canada paralyze each other over carbon, scoring, and retaliatory spikes, China is quietly capturing lost market share from both. Meanwhile, the U.S. auto sector is bleeding margin. Ford's June 30th internal report to investors forecast a 9.2% rise in component costs from Canadian tariffs alone. General Motors issued a supply chain volatility warning in its second quarter filing with the SEC. Tesla, hit from both ends, retaliatory tariffs and carbon content risk, halted aluminum procurement from Quebec, and opened talks with Vietnam. Elon Musk himself said on July 3rd, "We cannot afford uncertainty in origin certificates when credit access depends on emission scores." Ottawa didn't just weaponize tariffs, it weaponized traceability. And yet, Trump's electoral base is trapped in the middle. Steel workers in Pennsylvania are seeing layoffs not from offshoring, but from inventory gluts as Canadian buyers evaporate. The American Iron and Steel Institute estimates that a 4-point decline in capacity utilization will eliminate 7,800 jobs by year-end, 4,200 in Ohio alone. These are the states Trump needs to win, but the very tariffs meant to protect them are pricing them out. The contradiction is now measurable, and it's on the ballot. At a closed July 5th briefing in Mar-a-Lago, captured in part by Wall Street Journal sources, economic aides proposed a tariff scaling formula. 25% now, 15% by the fourth quarter, pending Canadian rollback. Trump reportedly rejected it, insisting, "We show weakness. We lose Ohio." But internal campaign polling leaked to Reuters shows shifting winds. Among Republican voters in Michigan's industrial suburbs, support for tariffs has dropped from 71% in February to 51% in July. The issue is no longer ideological. It's personal. Jobs, not rhetoric. And Carney, he's not campaigning. He's calibrating. In coordination with finance and industry ministries, Ottawa quietly launched the Stability Signal Package, $1.2 billion Canadian dollars in export insurance for Canadian firms impacted by tariff disruption. Simultaneously, it expanded carbon traceable export labels for aluminum and steel, branding itself as the continent's clean materials hub. According to the International Energy Agency, Canada's median carbon output per ton of steel is now 1.4 metric tons, compared to the US's 2.3. This isn't PR, it's leverage. And leverage travels. On July 8th, the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade added Canadian aluminum to its preferred origin list for procurement tenders. Two major German automakers, BMW and Mercedes-Benz, signed conditional supply memorandums of understanding with Alcan and ArcelorMittal Canada. These deals didn't exist in March. The tariffs made them happen. Every ton the US blocks, Europe reroutes. Every penalty intended to punish ends up as a subsidy for someone else. Now enter the energy dimension. Despite all escalations, Carney has avoided one red button: crude exports. Canada still sends 69% of its oil to the US, primarily through Line 3 and Keystone. Those flows backstop provincial budgets and federal swaps. But, a draft memo reviewed by Reuters outlines a contingency framework, a Canadian $8 billion infrastructure acceleration plan tied to Pacific Coast LNG terminals and westbound pipeline extensions, meant to shift Canadian dependency away from U.S. refineries. Ottawa hasn't announced it, but it exists. Trump's camp, according to a July 7th Wall Street Journal report, is preparing a counter-narrative that Canada's response proves U.S. dominance, that tariffs force obedience. But honestly, the economic data suggests otherwise. The Canadian loonie has stabilized. Foreign direct investment in Canadian green metals rose 11% in the second quarter, and the Toronto Stock Exchange's Clean Industrial Index has outperformed the S&P 500 by 4.6% since the tariffs were announced. If this is collapse, investors aren't acting like it. At the WTO, Canada's legal filing is ready. The draft argues that Washington violated Article 21 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, misusing national security for economic gain. The U.S. will contest jurisdiction. The dispute may sit for years. But as FT's Alan Beatty notes, the purpose is not the verdict. It's the record. Canada wants the footnote that says, "We didn't break the rules. We reacted to the ones that were broken." The White House hasn't blinked. Trump's latest messaging, "Retaliation is surrender," is polling well among base voters. But in industrial boardrooms and supply chain briefings, panic spreads. Freight costs are up. Origin tracing has become a compliance nightmare. And dozens of small to mid-size U.S. suppliers, who built entire operations around low-tariff Canada, now face bankruptcy timelines measured in quarters, not years. This isn't about aluminum, or steel, or even trade. It's about power. Who gets to define it, who gets to enforce it, and who pays for its illusions. What began as a tariff has become a test of what rules mean when rules are broken first. In that space, where retaliation, strategy, and legitimacy collide, lies the real cost of this war. And it won't be measured in dollars. It'll be measured in precedent. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.